Mark Pope and Bruce Pearl had a very happy NBA draft withdrawal deadline with key guards returning to both Kentucky and Auburn.
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, folks? Happy Thursday and welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, a daily national college hoop show, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host for today's show, Andy Patton, and you are joining at the place to get your college basketball content every single day. I want to thank all of you who have made this show your first listen or your first watch of the day, and remind you that you can listen to the show ad-free on Amazon Music. And we got to give a special shout out to those everyday listeners as well, and those of you joining us on the Locked On College Basketball Discord community. Folks, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first bet of $5 or more wins. Well, the NBA draft withdrawal deadline has passed officially. The deadline was, of course, Wednesday, May 28th. I know Isaac and Leaf did a great job covering some of the late movement, the late withdrawals, and guys staying in the draft. Cedric Coward, Milos Uzan, Jaxel Lendeberg, Alex Condon, all those guys were covered in previous episodes of Locked On College Basketball. But today, we're just going to kind of clear out the rest. The guys who made it literally the last minute possible decisions, waited until the actual final day. We're going to talk about a couple of big returners to the SEC in Otega Oweh and Tahaad Pettiford. We're going to talk about some guys staying in the draft, including two of the top transfer portal targets now off the no longer available. And then we're also going to we're going to close the show talking about Mark Few and the Zags landing a big-time player in the transfer portal in Tyon Grant Foster. We'll get to that to close out the show. We're going to talk about six guys who are returning to college basketball next year. We'll focus mostly on the two SEC guards in Otega Oweh and Tahaad Pettiford, as they're kind of the more notable or more surprising names. And I guess really Pettiford is the surprising name. I don't think it's a shocker that Otega Oweh is coming back to Kentucky. We'll start with him. I'm going to go off a recent ESPN mock draft. I trust the work that Jonathan Givony and Jeremy Wu do a lot. They also take scouting reports and direct feedback that they get from scouts into consideration. There are a lot of other great mock drafts out there, but most of them are the opinion of one or two people who create the mock draft, whereas guys like Givony and Wu are getting actual feedback. So I think it makes it a little bit more accurate. Regardless, the most recent ESPN mock draft did not have Otega Oweh in the draft, and that's been fairly consensus across most of the mock drafts. Wasn't really an expectation that he would get selected this year, despite coming off an excellent season last year, his first year under Coach Mark Pope with the Wildcats. He averaged just over 16 points, about 5 boards, 1.5 steals per game. But again, while he was kind of that key two guard for them, really engaged in a lot of their action. I know Lamont Butler and Kirk Risa were the point guards, but for a long period of time, Kentucky didn't have either of them, and Oweh kind of had to step into that lead guard role, and he just looked outstanding filling that role last year. I don't think it's a role that would really translate to the NBA, which I think is part of where some of that hesitation comes in on him as a draft prospect, but he absolutely has the size, the skill set to potentially be an NBA player down the line. But what a great get for Mark Pope in Kentucky to have him back in the mix. We've talked a lot about this Wildcats team and how deep they are. We talked about it just earlier this week, in fact, after they made an addition in Braden Hawthorne, their incoming freshman, their fourth, I believe, incoming freshman in this class. Just a tremendously deep roster overall for Mark Pope in Kentucky. And when we had that conversation, and when we had the same conversation previously, when they landed Reese Potter, big man from Miami, Ohio, out of the transfer portal, we kind of said, this is the deepest team in college basketball, assuming Otega Oweh comes back, because that was always kind of the assumption. And now it's no longer an assumption. It is the reality. And we're looking at a roster that is 3 to 4 deep at every single position, that has 15 players who, on most any other roster in college basketball, these guys would play legitimate roles. I mean, just the backcourt alone. Now, Otega Oweh joins a group that also includes Jalen Lowe, who was in the draft process before pulling out, transfer from Pitt, who was outstanding last year for the Panthers. It also includes Denzel Aberdeen, who was the third guard on the national champion Florida Gators team. It also includes Jasper Johnson, the 24th ranked player in the 2025 recruiting class. It includes Colin Chandler, a returner who was very good in a small role last year. Where the heck's he going to play this year? I mean, he's the 6th guard on this roster. It's just absurd or 5th guard on this roster. Either way, it's absurd how deep Mark Pope's team is next year. I can guarantee you that Otega Oweh is going to play a very similar role. He's going to be the starting two guard. Maybe he starts at the three, depending on how Mark Pope wants to make this thing work for the Wildcats. But gosh, this team is going to be really, really good next year if Pope can find a way to get all these pieces to gel together, which he managed to do last year with a very new look roster. This roster's got more returners, Oweh among them, of course, Brandon Garrison. We talked about Colin Chandler, Trent Noah coming back as well. So there's some continuity, not a ton necessarily, not as much as you're used to in the previous eras of college basketball, but more than they had last year, and they were pretty good last year. So I think there's a lot of reasons to be excited if you're a member of Big Blue Nation out in Lexington right now. But if you want to look for a reason to maybe be a little bit more skeptical, the Auburn Tigers certainly got themselves some great news. Probably the most unexpected news, I think, of the day, at least amongst the returners. Tahaad Pettiford was mocked as a potential late first-round pick. That aforementioned ESPN mock had him 37th, so not in the first round, but in the first part of the second round, certainly. And we've seen him creeping up in like the late 20s, right at the end of that first round. And so kind of one of the few players who was really in that conversation outside of Yaxel Lendeberg, who made the decision to come back to school. And this is just incredible news for Bruce Pearl and the Tigers. Pettiford's numbers last year, 11.5 points, 3 assists, 37% from three on about 5 attempts per game. As a true freshman last year, he's an undersized guard, very likely something that will inhibit him at the next level. Again, the fact that he was getting first-round buzz as a 6-foot guard is pretty unheard of, and a sign of how much scouts and analysts believed in his shot making, which is just such an elite skill. I think he does a lot of things well. He's a tenacious player. He works hard defensively. His facilitation skills, I think, are on the up and up. They're not great, but they're far from bad at this point either. But more than anything else, this dude is a shot maker. He knocks down shots. He takes tough shots. He's really, really good at that. And now he's going to step into an even bigger role for an Auburn offense that loses Chad Baker-Mazara to USC. They lose Miles Kelly, Denver Jones, JP Pegues. Pretty much their entire backcourt is being replaced. Of course, Janai Broome out the door as well. This is a very new look Auburn roster. And they get back the most important piece that they could have returned this offseason in Tahaad Pettiford. He's going to be one of the best players in college basketball next year. I would not be surprised if he is an all-SEC guard. And again, it's projecting him to be an all-SEC guard may not seem that crazy, but we're talking about a conference that has Boogie Flan and Xavier Lee, both at Florida, that has the great guards over at Arkansas, that obviously just got Otega Oweh back at Kentucky. Like, there are tremendous amount of talent in the backcourts in the SEC, and Tahaad Pettiford is right up there among the best. And this is a huge return for Bruce Pearl and Auburn, who also on the same day landed a European prospect, Serbian big man Filip Jovic as well. So really nice day for Bruce Pearl. He's smiling somewhere out in Auburn right now with Pettiford coming back and Jovic coming into the mix for his Tigers team. A couple other guys who are returning to school as well. Perhaps the next most surprising one, Miles Byrd from San Diego State. And he was truly a 50-50 guy, so I don't think it was a surprise that much. It's certainly more of a surprise than these other three guys we're going to mention here in passing. But Miles Byrd was on mock drafts. In fact, ESPN had him 43rd to the Jazz in their latest mock draft. Averaged about 12 points, 4 boards, 2.5 assists per game last year. Very, very good defensive player. The concern was the three-point shooting. He took about 6 3-point attempts per game last year, but he only shot 30%. I think he was good. He was trending towards the mid-second round, obviously, like we said, 43rd in that latest mock from ESPN, but chooses to come back to San Diego State. And what a get for Brian Dutcher and the Aztecs. A common phrase, you've seen it if you're a member of Trilly Donovan's Discord community. Sometimes the best gets are the ones you already had. And I think that's really true here for San Diego State, who not only gets Miles Byrd back, but they also got Magoon Gwath back, who entered the transfer portal and entered the NBA draft process really early in the offseason, and also very early in the offseason decided, you know what, never mind. I'm not going to the NBA. I'm not entering the transfer portal. I'm coming back. I'm running it back for year 2 at San Diego State. For the Aztecs to return 2 really key pieces, 2 potential future NBA players. Gwath probably wasn't ready, but Miles Byrd, again, was showing up on the mocks to get both those guys back. And as a reminder, they pretty much lost Reese Dixon Waters for the entire season last year. He's expected to be healthy again. So it's kind of like you're getting another new guard into the mix, as well as having these 2 incredibly key pieces, Byrd at the wing and Gwath at the the center position. Getting those guys back in the mix is just really great news for the Aztecs in their final year of the Mountain West Conference. It's going to run through the Viejas Arena once again. Colorado State, Boise State, those teams are going to be in the mix, but gosh, it's hard to not think that Brian Dutcher and the Aztecs have a big advantage right now. 3 more guys to talk about, all returning to Big Ten teams. Nate Bittle is back for the Oregon Ducks. All 3 of these guys were unranked on the latest ESPN mock draft, and none of them are real shockers that they're coming back to school. In fact, they would have been far more surprising if any of these 3 guys stayed in the NBA draft process. Bittle averaged 14 points, 7.5 boards, 2 blocks last year for the Ducks. 7-foot anchor, returns to Oregon alongside rising juniors Jackson Shellstat and KJ Evans. Could see him being a 2-way guy in the NBA in the future. I think he's got the skill set, especially as a developing 3-point shooter who was really good at the free throw line last year. But I'm not surprised to see him back in action for the Ducks. Great get for Dana Altman. Then you got John Blackwell at Wisconsin, also unranked on the mock draft. 16 points, 5 boards, a little over 2 assists per game last year. Great free throw shooter. So was everybody at Wisconsin last year, but only 32% from 3. Really, really good news for the Badgers, who obviously lost John Tonje, who's in the NBA draft process, likely going to get selected. But they also did bring in Nick Boyd from San Diego State, as well as Andrew Rohde from Virginia. So Boyd, Rohde, and Blackwell back for Wisconsin. That's going to be one of the best guard rooms in the entire Big Ten Conference. And then speaking of great Big Ten guards, I guess he's more of a wing, but we'll use it as the transition anyway. Nick Martinelli back for Northwestern again. Not a shock here, but this is a dude who averaged 20.5 points per game last year. There's not a lot of guys who average 20-plus points in a power conference who return to school, but Martinelli is doing exactly that. Also averaged over 6 boards, a little under 2 assists. Played an astonishing 37.6 minutes per game last year. If you tuned into a Northwestern game for any reason, you probably didn't see Nick Martinelli on the bench, and I expect more of the same for him as a senior next year. I wouldn't be shocked at all if he is returning, but if he also leads the conference in scoring for a second straight year. Well, folks, 2 of the best available transfers opted to stay in the NBA draft process instead of finding a new home in the transfer portal. We're going to talk about that. Plus, Coach John Calipari getting some bad news for his Arkansas club. Not all sunshine and roses in the SEC on the final day of the withdrawal deadline. We'll talk about that in just a second. But first, folks, the NBA playoffs are in full swing. Every night is delivering highlight-worthy performances, major momentum shifts, and can't-miss moments as we are very close to finding out the full matchup of the NBA Finals. So whether it's a game-winning shot or a breakout player, there's never been a better time to get in on all the action. And FanDuel makes it easy to stay in the game before tip-off and live during games. With player props, performance trends, and same-game parlays, fans have more ways than ever to play smart and win big. And talking about odds on these teams we just spoke about, Kentucky up to plus 1,800 to win the 2026 national championship. They were at plus 2,000, so those odds are getting a little bit not as good if you want to throw some money down on the Wildcats. Auburn up at plus 2,500 after getting Tahaad Pettiford back as well. And if you're new to FanDuel, folks, it's the perfect time to sign up. If you head to FanDuel.com and place your first $5 bet, if it wins, you'll get $200 in bonus bets. So make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton here, still Locked On College Basketball Podcast, and we're moving on to talking about the players who are returning to school on the NBA draft withdrawal deadline, which was on Wednesday, to instead talking about some guys who are staying in the draft process. 4 total players we're going to talk about here in the second segment. 2 of them were in the transfer portal, which means it removes 2 of the best players available in the transfer portal, takes them off the market. The other 2 were, one was at an SEC school for John Calipari and the Hogs, and then one of them was at a Big Ten school. We'll get to those guys in a second. But let's start with the 2 transfers. We'll start with Florida State's Jamir Watkins, who on the latest ESPN mock was 44th to the Oklahoma City Thunder last year, his senior year for Florida State. Watkins averaged 18.5 points, a little under 6 boards, 2.5 assists per game. Not a great three-point shooter, never has been in his career, but he's an excellent foul merchant. Last year, he shot just under 8 free throw attempts per game. His 18.5 points was 4th in the ACC. He was a second teamer in the conference. His 183 made free throws was the 11th most in the entire country. And in fact, Watkins was the only player in all of college basketball last year to have multiple games where he attempted 20 or more free throws in a single contest. Now, is that specific volume of free throws going to translate to the NBA? No, because he's probably not going to be in a role where he's, constantly driving to the rim. But the ability to put the ball on the deck, get to the rim, acrobatically finish through contact, or at least draw contact and get to the free throw line is a highly coveted skill in the modern NBA. Outside of that, Watkins, 6'6", I think is what he measured without shoes. He's listed at 6'7", but he has a 6'11.25" wingspan. And that's a huge selling point for Watkins. He also played well at the combine. His second scrimmage in particular, he had 23 points on highly efficient shooting. So to look good in the scrimmages, to look good in the combine, to measure well, to have a very easily translatable skill. Again, you'd like to, for a guy who kind of projects as like a 6'7" wing who plays good defense, you'd like to have the three part in order to be a 3-and-D wing. He doesn't really have that, although I suspect that with NBA training and NBA, just with the NBA lifestyle where you're not going to school and working on any of that, I think that the spacing in the league will probably allow Watkins to be a more adequate three-point shooter. If he's 37% from three, he's capable of attacking closeouts, getting to the free throw line, plays good defense. That's an NBA player. Is it a guy who goes in the first round? No. But is it a guy you take a chance on in the middle of the second round, like the mock has him here to Oklahoma City? Absolutely. I wouldn't be surprised at all if Watkins finds himself carving out a solid career at the next level, doing exactly that. Now, he could have got himself a big old bag if he'd come back to college. He declared last year, while was also in the transfer portal last year, withdrew his name from the NBA draft and withdrew his name from the portal and just returned to Florida State. This year, he decides to stay in the draft as opposed to hitting the transfer portal. But I can't imagine that Kansas wouldn't have given him a call after missing out on Darion Williams. North Carolina, I think, made some sense. Villanova made some sense. All these are schools that were also on the list for the next guy that we're going to talk about, which is RJ Lewis, who was, of course, at St. John's last year, but was also in the transfer portal, also unranked on our latest ESPN mock draft. Probably the most surprising of the guys staying in the draft. We can debate whether it's him or Yannick Konen-Niederhauser from Penn State, but RJ Lewis is a guy that wasn't really ever showing up on a lot of mock drafts. Like it doesn't seem at this point particularly likely that he is going to get drafted. Now, he could pop in some individual workouts over the next month and certainly get himself in that conversation. And the amount of players withdrawing from the draft probably means that every mock draft you've read in the last month had Tahaad Pettiford. They all had Yaxel Lendeberg. They all had, Milos Uzan on him. And so those guys not being on those mock drafts, maybe that's where RJ Lewis can kind of sneak in, but he's far from a sure thing as a draft pick coming off of a season where he was an All-American. He was the Big East Player of the Year. He averaged 18 points a game for Rick Pitino and the Johnnies. He will unfortunately be remembered by a lot of folks for his final game, which was the worst game in terms of context, probably of his entire career. Shot 3 of 17 in that second round matchup, a loss by St. John's to Arkansas. Was benched for the final 5 minutes of the game. Pitino was not happy. With him, was comfortable talking about it after the game. Lewis entered the transfer portal in the NBA draft very quickly after that game. It doesn't sound like there's a lot of bad blood there. Maybe there is, and they're just kind of, not talking about it too much, but it is kind of a lasting image of Lewis, unfortunately, because he was really, really good for St. John's. He's the reason they were a 2 seed in the NCAA tournament. So it's unfortunate that that's kind of what people will remember. But he could have, like Watkins, he could have commanded a big old payday in the transfer portal. North Carolina was interested. Kansas was interested. Ole Miss, Villanova, we talked about them. Georgetown was also interested in him. I think Miami was going to drop a huge bag if they could. Coach Jay Lucas has been going after Miami homegrown guys, trying to get them in the transfer portal. We know they were connected to Lewis shortly after he entered the portal. I know Oregon was connected to him for a while as well. I'm sure he would have gotten himself a huge bag. And frankly, he didn't even play all that well at the combine. His numbers in the scrimmages were good, like 15 points, I think 30 points in the 2 scrimmages, so 15 per game. But he was 9 of 29 shooting the basketball. He was 3 of 10 from 3. So he didn't really pop at the combine all that well. I'll be interested to see what happens to him. I think he's a talented player. I don't want to denigrate him more than we already have, but I'm interested to see what happens here, because I think he could have commanded millions and millions of dollars and been a high profile potential first team All-American next year at the college level. And I'm not sure what kind of recognition he's going to get next year in the NBA or in the G League or wherever he ends up. 2 more guys to talk about here. Aduk Thiero from Arkansas, staying in the draft. This is not a surprise to me. It was ESPN mocked him 34th in their latest mock draft to Charlotte. Thiero averaged 15 points, 6 boards, 1.5 steals last year for John Calipari and the Hogs. Obviously followed Coach Cal from Kentucky to Arkansas. The deal with Thiero is he's not a good shooter. 25.5% from 3 last year. He's never been a good 3-point shooter, career 28.5%. That's just not what he does. Again, he's a 3-and-D wing without the 3, just like Jamir Watkins. But Thiero is an elite athlete. He is an extraordinarily gifted athlete. He's a highly efficient scorer outside of the outside shot. Unfortunately, the free throw shooting kind of ticked down last year as well. He was under 70%, but he was 80% his sophomore year at Kentucky. So maybe there's some optimism that outside shot will be there. But even if not, he's a great defender. He's a high-level athlete. He's just got the requisite size, athleticism, mobility, hustle, all those things to be a quality NBA player, even without the floor spacing ability, which again, I think can probably tick up in an NBA system. For Coach Calipari in Arkansas, they kind of already, I think, had moved on a little bit from Thiero, especially with the recent news of both Carter Knox and Billy Richmond coming back, the two of the 3 prized freshmen in Coach Cal's class last year, the other, of course, being Boogie Fland. Boogie Fland's the only one who's not returning to Arkansas, although he is not going to the NBA as he is transferred to Florida. But with Knox and Richmond back and both kind of fully expected to take on much bigger roles next year, I think if you're an Arkansas fan, you'd like to have Thiero back, but I think most of them kind of expected that was not going to happen. They also have a great recruiting class coming in, although mostly guards. The 2 elite players are Darius Acuff and Malik Thomas, who are 5th and 13th in the recruiting class, the 2025 class, respectively. Both of them are 6'3" or shorter, so they're not really replacing Thiero. They do have Isaiah Sealy, who's a 6'7", 4-star small forward coming in, so he's kind of more of a Thiero-type replacement, but I expect he'll be behind both Knox and Richmond and the depth chart for the Hogs in Fayetteville this year. And then last but not least, Yannick Conan Niederhauser from Penn State, 36th to Brooklyn in ESPN's latest mock. Niederhauser averaged 13.6 boards, 2.3 blocks per game last year. He's a 6'10", super athletic big man who proved he's more than capable of protecting the rim. He was a transfer from Northern Illinois who led his conference in blocks at Northern Illinois and then led the Big Ten in blocks last year for the Nittany Lions. He does not have an outside shot. He is not a great free throw shooter. The odds of him becoming an outside shooter are very slim. He was one of 5 players who was invited from the G League Elite Camp to the NBA Draft Combine. The others were Mackenzie Mbako, Ryan Nembhard from Gonzaga was one of them, Niederhauser, and then there was 2 others who I'm blanking on right now. But Niederhauser, the most likely of that group to get selected. Mbako has already returned to Texas A&M. Nembhard has kind of shown up later on some of those mock drafts, but this Tamar Bates was another one of them. I knew it would come to me eventually. Regardless, Niederhauser, very, very talented player. This is a tough loss for Penn State. While I think Thiero was expected for Arkansas, and they kind of covered that just by getting Knox back, and while obviously Lewis and Watkins, their teams had already kind of moved on from those guys since they entered the portal, I think Niederhauser, by virtue of being, he was a late riser, he was not on mock drafts for most of this cycle. Again, he wasn't even invited to the combine until he balled out at the elite camp. It doesn't look like Penn State really replaced him on the roster. They only have 1 transfer portal addition. It's a shooting guard, Josh Reed from Cincinnati. They have a trio of freshmen. One of them, their best freshman, is a 6'2" point guard, Caden Mingo, 34th in the class. 6'7" small forward, Mason Blackwood's just outside the top 100. And then 6'11" center, Justin Hauser, but he's 226th in the recruiting class, not somebody I expect to step into a big role right away. So Coach Mike Rhodes might have some work to do in the transfer portal, kind of see if he can find some big men who are available. Not a ton of left, but you got to find something because Niederhauser is a really tough loss for the Nittany Lions going into next season. Well, folks, Mark Few and the Zags landed an elite scoring wing in Tyon Grant Foster out of the transfer portal. How might he fit onto this new look roster in Spokane? We're going to talk about that to close out the show coming up in just a second. All right, folks, segment 3, still Andy Patton, still Locked On College Basketball Podcast. We're closing out the show with the big transfer portal news of the day on Wednesday. There was 3 kind of 6'7" small forwards who were at the top of the list in the transfer portal. All 3 of them are no longer available. We already talked about 2 of them, Jamir Watkins, who is staying in the NBA draft process, RJ Lewis, who is staying in the NBA draft process. So if you were a team in need of a wing, and you were looking in the transfer portal and those 2 guys were checked off the list, the next name you were going to look at almost certainly was Grand Canyon transfer and former WAC Player of the Year, Tyon Grant Foster. But unfortunately, it's not a place you can look anymore, as Mark Few and the Gonzaga Bulldogs snapped him up for their second transfer portal addition outside of Arizona State shooting guard Adam Miller. And I should say that this transfer portal addition is predicated on Tyon Grant Foster getting a waiver from the NCAA. And despite being 25 years old, And despite starting his college basketball career officially in 2018, you may think, well, why on earth would Tyon Grant Foster get a waiver? Well, it's actually, in my opinion, feels like a fairly cut and dry situation. Grant Foster spent 2 years at the junior college level. Both those years should count against him, with the caveat that all junior college players have been granted an extra year of eligibility. Grant Foster then spent 1 year at Kansas, where he played like 22 games. That should count against him, except that was the 2020-21 season, the COVID year, when those years of eligibility are not being counted against players in the college basketball eligibility space. So if that year doesn't count against him, the next year he played a half a game at DePaul before collapsing in the locker room. A really tragic story for those who don't know it. I won't get into all the details, but he suffered, he had to be revived by trainers. He was having a serious heart issues. He ended up having multiple heart surgeries, missed the rest of that season at DePaul, missed the entire next season, was told by medical professionals he would not play basketball again. Not only did he play basketball again, he was the best player in the Western Athletic Conference at Grand Canyon in the 23-24 season. So 2 years at Grand Canyon, 2 years at the junior college level, and 1 year at Kansas that should be wiped out because it was the COVID year. I think that probably means he will get another year of eligibility. And if he does, he's going to spend it playing for Mark Few and the Zags. Grant Foster, a really nice fit for this team. He's kind of their Caliph Battle replacement. Caliph Battle, of course, a transfer who joined the team as a veteran who'd been at multiple places, who was in his 6th year of college basketball last year for the Zags. And Caliph Battle was kind of the three who operated. They had their starting facilitating point guard, Ryan Nembhard. They had their starting 2 guard, who was a 3-point specialist in Nolan Hickman. And then they had their starting small forward, who was more of a rim pressure guy, liked to get out in transition, played solid defense, but tried to get to the free throw line, tried to draw contact that way. And I think that Gonzaga's kind of running it back with similar aesthetics this year. They have Braden Smith, not that Braden Smith, the Colgate transfer who redshirted last year, whose play style is very similar to Ryan Nembhard's. Adam Miller was a 43% three-point shooter as a 6'3" 2 guard last year at Arizona State. That's basically exactly what Nolan Hickman did at Gonzaga, so he's your replacement there. And then Tyon Grant Foster is kind of your replacement for Caliph Battle. And you look at the skill sets for what what Grant Foster has done successfully in college basketball, and it's a lot of the same stuff. His best season was, again, that elite season at Grand Canyon where he averaged 20.6 boards, was 50% on 2-pointers, 33% from 3, over 8 free throw attempts per game, 74.5%. So not quite as good of a free throw shooter as Caliph Battle, who was over 90% last year, but was one of the best scorers in all of college basketball that year, was great at getting to the free throw line. This past year at Grand Canyon, he dealt with an ankle injury early in the year, and it really slowed him down, and he didn't quite fully recover. And a look at his full season line doesn't really tell you a great picture. Last year for the Lopes, he averaged under 15 points, under 6 boards, 23% from 3, shot 68.5% from the free throw line. Like, a lot of things that were kind of concerning, but after that ankle injury finally healed, in his final 9 games with Grand Canyon, Grant Foster averaged 17.5 points, shot 31.5% from 3, 59.5% on 2-pointers, looked like a much more efficient version of the player that he had been in his WAC Player of the Year season previously. And he had 23 points in the NCAA tournament in a loss to Maryland. He had 29 points in the tournament the previous year in a loss to Alabama. This kid is really good at playing up in those NCAA tournament games. And now he comes to Gonzaga, where he's going to have a great opportunity to step into that starting small forward role. Gonzaga, of course, returns their 2 bigs. Braden Huff and Graham Ike are both back. They're both expected to start together after they kind of were the starting and backup center the last couple of years in Spokane. Now they're going to start together. We'll see how Huff adjusts to being a power forward. But they started the last 3 games of last year, which was a big win over St. Mary's in the WCC championship. It was a win over Georgia in the first round of the NCAA tournament. And then it was a very close loss to eventual Final Four national championship runner-up Houston, a game that they had a chance to get a good look to tie that game in the final seconds. And Graham Ike had 28 in that game, in part because he started alongside Braden Huff, and it was a matchup problem for the opposing team. So I think for Grant Foster at 6'7", with a ton of length, guy who's averaged over 1.5 blocks per game in each of the last 2 years and over 1.5 steals per game in each of the past 2 years. He adds defensive versatility, length on the perimeter, high scoring mentality. He's going to wreak havoc in transition for this Gonzaga team. Unquestionably, he's going to be a menace out there. He's going to be a problem defensively. This likely shifts Jalen Warley, the transfer who he transferred from Virginia because he had transferred to Virginia from Florida State, but he never actually played at Virginia as he entered the portal after Tony Bennett's surprise retirement. So Jalen Warley is going to be in the mix. He's a 6'7" kind of facilitating point forward type who's also a great defender. So this Gonzaga team's got a ton of length, a ton of defense. I'll tell you this, I wouldn't be surprised if this is Mark Few's best defensive team of the last half decade, maybe even since the 2016-17 team that went to the national championship. I think this is going to be a very good defensive unit for this Gonzaga team. I think Grant Foster is going to be a big part of it. And this is a really plus addition. But like we said, it also takes away the three best small forwards on the market are all gone in a flash like that. And I think, again, a lot of people probably expected Watkins and Lewis to make the decisions that they made. But for teams like Kansas, for teams like North Carolina, for teams like Villanova and Georgetown and Ole Miss, who are kind of been hunting for some of those guys, like a lot of options just flew off the board very suddenly. And we'll be interested to see what direction they pivot, whether there's more movement for somebody like Desmond Claude, who's not really a three, but could certainly fill at least like a high scoring guard role for some of these teams. It'll be interesting to see kind of what the reaction is to what ended up being a not good day for teams in the market for a wing in the transfer portal, because the three very best of them are all gone. And Mark Few and the Zags made sure they didn't have to go home empty handed by snagging Ty and Grant Foster here. Folks, that's going to wrap it up for me today here on the Locked On College Basketball Podcast. Thank you so much to those of you who have made this show your first listen or your first watch of the day. Isaac and I will be back with you all on Friday, giving you our draft deadline winners, our draft deadline losers. We'll talk some scheduling stuff as well. It's going to be a lot of fun. Check that one out on Friday. Thanks again, folks. Have a fantastic rest of your day, though. As always, we want to say apologies to the Lawyer family. Let's go Wild Popes. Great day for them. Cheers to the McBruins. And until tomorrow, peace out.